In 1797, Britain is bankrupt. The nation's most trusted financial instrument has lost nearly half its value. The treasury is hemorrhaging money. The gold standard has just collapsed. And yet, within 3 decades, this same financial crisis will make London the richest city on the face of the earth. That is not an exaggeration. That is not a metaphor. That is what actually happened, and it is one of the strangest, most counterintuitive stories in the history of money. The government owed more than £1 billion, a figure so enormous that no nation in history had ever carried such a debt and survived. This wasn't just about money. Britain's ability to fight Napoleon, to fund its navy, to hold together its alliances, all of it depended on pieces of paper called consols, government bonds. If those bonds failed, Britain failed, and in the 1790s, they were failing. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a financial catastrophe became the greatest wealth engine the modern world had ever seen. So how did a nation drowning in debt, spending more than any empire before it, somehow emerge not just victorious, but fabulously, obscenely wealthy? The answer isn't on any battlefield. It's in a bond market. And the men who understood this, a handful of financiers, economists, and speculators, would ride this wave to build dynasties that still exist today. How could the worst financial crisis in British history become the foundation of the greatest wealth transfer in European history? This is the story of how war, debt, and a single financial instrument called the Consol turned London into the capital of global finance. It's not a story of generals and battlefields. It's a story of money and the men who knew how to make it bleed. Let me set the stage. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind history's greatest power shifts, hit that like button and subscribe. We go deep on the wars, the money, and the decisions that shaped the modern world. Now, let me take you back to the 1790s. Revolutionary France had upended Europe. The old monarchies were scrambling. Austria, Prussia, Spain, the Dutch Republic, all of them suddenly facing not just a rival kingdom, but a revolutionary republic that wanted to remake the entire European order. And across the English Channel, Britain watched with mounting alarm. Here was an island nation with a modest standing army, but the world's most powerful navy, and it faced a new kind of enemy, one fueled by ideology, mass conscription, and an almost limitless appetite for war. The fighting began in 1793. Britain entered not with a grand invasion plan, but with its traditional weapon, money. London would finance coalitions, subsidize allies, and keep the Royal Navy at sea. But all of this required one thing: the ability to borrow. Britain didn't fight Napoleon primarily with muskets. It defeated him with money. And the weapon it used to raise that money was a financial instrument most people have never heard of. So what exactly were consols? In plain language, they were perpetual government bonds. You bought one, and the government paid you interest forever. No maturity date, no endpoint, just a stream of income backed by the full faith of the British Treasury. The catch was that their price fluctuated based on confidence. When people trusted the government, consols rose. When fear spread, they fell. They were, in effect, a real-time confidence meter for the British state. Think of consols as the heartbeat monitor of the British Empire. Every spike, every crash, every flutter told you exactly how the nation felt about its own survival. If you've ever watched a stock price swing wildly on news, you already understand consols. Except the stock was Britain itself. And the man who had staked the nation's future on this instrument was William Pitt the Younger. He became Prime Minister at 24, the youngest in British history. Brilliant, driven, but about to face a financial nightmare no amount of political genius could easily solve. Pitt's strategy was straightforward in concept and terrifying in scale. Borrow massively through consols, tax aggressively, and keep the coalitions funded. It was a strategy that depended entirely on market confidence. Every new bond issue required investors to believe that Britain would win, or at least survive. Every tax increase required a population willing to bear the burden, and every coalition payment required allies willing to keep fighting. The whole edifice rested on trust. But what happens when confidence collapses? What happens when the very instrument you're using to fund a world war starts to implode? Pitt was about to find out. To understand the scale of what came next, you need to see the numbers. And the numbers are staggering. Over the course of 22 years of war, Britain added more than £500 million to its national debt. Net annual additions averaged between 5.75 and 6.75% of the entire national income, year after year after year. Total direct military costs exceeded £1 billion. To put that in perspective, £1 billion in 1815 was a sum so vast that no nation in history had ever owed anything close to it. Britain wasn't just at war. It was leveraged to the hilt. To service this debt, taxes per capita multiplied sevenfold compared to William III's wars a century earlier. Sevenfold. Every farmer, every merchant, every factory owner felt the squeeze. The money went to naval supremacy, to coalition subsidies, to army provisioning. Britain was funding not just its own war effort, but bankrolling half of Europe's resistance to Napoleon. The sheer scale of spending was almost incomprehensible, absorbing resources that dwarfed anything the country had previously attempted. But here's the thing most people miss about Britain's war spending. It wasn't all waste. The tax revenues that serviced this mountain of debt were supported by something new, something revolutionary. New industries, textiles, iron, manufacturing, were generating revenue streams that didn't exist a generation earlier. The war economy wasn't just draining Britain, it was, paradoxically, accelerating the development of entirely new sectors. Cotton mills hummed in Lancashire, iron foundries blazed in the Midlands, coal output surged. Export volumes, against all logic, were growing even during wartime. Britain was spending money it didn't have on a war it couldn't afford, funded by industries that barely existed 20 years earlier. And somehow it was working. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. After the American War of Independence, consols had rallied from £55 to £90 between 1784 and 1792, fueling a decade of economic growth. The pattern was there for anyone paying attention. War crashes bonds, peace sends them soaring. The question was whether anyone would survive long enough to see the peace. And behind all of this sat Britain's single greatest structural advantage: its navy. Naval supremacy meant that while continental armies marched and countermarched across Europe, bleeding nations dry, the Royal Navy kept the sea lanes open. This is the single most important strategic fact of the entire war. While France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia bled on land, Britain controlled the oceans. That meant trade. That meant customs revenue. That meant the ability to keep borrowing when every rational calculation said the credit should have run dry. Continental rivals had no such lifeline. French trade was strangled by British blockades. Neutral nations like the United States found their ships seized by both sides. But British merchant vessels under naval escort kept moving, kept trading, kept generating the revenue that propped up the entire financial war machine. Yet even naval supremacy couldn't prevent what was coming. In 1797, the financial war nearly ended, not with a French invasion, but with a bank run. The crisis that hit London wasn't triggered by a battle. It was triggered by fear. The year is 1797. 5 years into the war, France is ascendant on land, its revolutionary armies sweeping across Italy and the Low Countries. Britain's continental allies are crumbling. Reports of a French invasion fleet circulate in the London papers. And in the city of London, the Consol's market is in freefall. Consols, which had traded at 90 in 1792, near their all-time highs, plunge below 51 by 1797 and 98. That's a drop of more than 43%. And because consols were the bedrock of British finance, held by banks, by insurance companies, by wealthy families, by anyone with serious capital. The losses rippled through the entire economy. The capital losses from this crash were equivalent to approximately 47% of GDP. Imagine nearly half the wealth of an entire nation evaporating. Not from invasion, not from plague, from a bond market collapse. This is the financial equivalent of a battlefield catastrophe, and it was about to get worse. In February of 1797, the Bank of England took a step that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. It suspended gold convertibility. Britain was off the gold standard. The Bank Restriction Act, a euphemism if there ever was one, meant that banknotes could no longer be exchanged for gold. The physical Consol certificates, heavy paper stamped with government seals, were now worth half what they had been a year ago, and the currency backing them had just been severed from its anchor. In the bank's decision room, the weight of what they were doing must have been suffocating. The scratch of quill on paper as clerks drafted the Restriction Act wasn't just administrative procedure, it was the sound of the old monetary order cracking. Pitt's nightmare had arrived. His entire war strategy depended on borrowing. Borrowing depended on confidence. And confidence had just cratered. But the Bank of England, acting as lender of last resort, began stabilizing the system. It was ugly, improvised, and desperate, but it worked. Just barely. The bank wasn't designed for this, no central bank was, but in 1797 it became something new, a backstop for an entire national economy at war. It printed, it lent, it absorbed the shock, and here was the paradox of the suspension. Going off gold was terrifying in the short term, but it gave Britain something its enemies didn't have: monetary flexibility, the ability to print, to lend, to keep the war machine funded even when gold reserves ran dry. A crisis that became a liberation. What looked like a catastrophe was in hindsight a discovery. Britain had accidentally stumbled into fiat money, government-backed currency unanchored from gold, and it would use that flexibility to outlast Napoleon for another 18 years. Not every observer saw catastrophe. Some saw opportunity. Nathan Meyer Rothschild had arrived in Manchester from Frankfurt around 1798, a young textile merchant with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. Rothschild had an almost supernatural feel for information and timing, and he was watching the Consols market with predatory focus. Alongside him, though operating from a very different vantage point, stood Alexander Baring, second-generation head of Barings, already one of London's most connected merchant banks. Baring understood that the government's debt was also its promise, and promises in wartime could be bought cheap. These men, and a handful of others like them, saw something in the wreckage of the 1797 crash that most people missed. They saw opportunity. Consols were trading at historic lows. If Britain survived the war, those bonds would be worth a fortune. But that was a very big if. Napoleon wasn't going anywhere, and while speculators quietly accumulated positions, the domestic economy bore the war's cost in other ways. While the government poured hundreds of millions into war bonds, domestic infrastructure starved. Total canal investment during this period, the arteries of the early industrial economy, amounted to roughly £20 million. Compare that to the mountain of wartime debt. The war was consuming capital that might otherwise have built the country. For nearly 2 decades, this tension would define Britain, a nation simultaneously building the world's most advanced industrial economy and bleeding itself dry to fight the world's most dangerous military power. Something had to give, and in the end it did, though not in the way anyone expected. The next 18 years would be a war of endurance, fought not just on battlefields but in bond markets, counting houses and customs offices across the globe. Napoleon understands something that most military commanders don't. He knows he can't beat the Royal Navy. He can't invade Britain. But he doesn't have to. He just has to cut off its trade. Beginning in 1806 and escalating through the Berlin and Milan decrees, Napoleon orders every nation under his influence to close its ports to British goods. The continental system is born. It's an economic blockade, a trade war layered on top of a shooting war. encompassing virtually the entire European coastline from Lisbon to the Baltic. The logic is brutal and elegant. If Britain can't sell its manufactured goods, it can't earn revenue. If it can't earn revenue, it can't service its debt. If it can't service its debt, the Consol's market collapses for good. And Britain falls not to a cannonball, but to a balance sheet. The domestic impact is immediate and painful. French harassment of shipping raises insurance costs. Coastal trade is disrupted. Grain and bread prices become wildly uneven across regions, what economists call heightened price dispersion. In some towns, bread is affordable. In others, it's a luxury. The war isn't just overseas anymore. It's in the markets, the bakeries, the household budgets of ordinary Britons. In London's coffee houses, where merchants gather to read dispatches and argue about prices, the mood is grim but defiant. Price lists pinned to wood-paneled walls tell the story: sugar up, cotton volatile, grain uncertain. The smell of coffee and tobacco mixes with anxiety. Every number is a battlefield. But here's what Napoleon didn't count on. The Royal Navy, still controlling the sea lanes, keeps global trade flowing where it matters most. British merchants reroute. Ships originally bound for Hamburg are redirected to Buenos Aires. Manifests are rewritten in dockside offices. New markets open in South America, in Asia, in the expanding colonies. The continental system hurts, but it doesn't kill, and the relative damage tells its own story. Neutral nations, especially the United States, are hit harder than Britain itself. Their ships are seized by both sides. Their trade routes are shattered, and on the continent, France's own allies suffer most. The blockade is a weapon that cuts both ways. This is now a global economic conflict. From the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the cotton mills of Lancashire to the ports of Baltimore, the ripple effects of Napoleon's blockade touch every corner of the Atlantic world. Napoleon's economic war is the most ambitious attempt to destroy a rival nation through commerce alone, and for a few years, it looks like it might work. While Napoleon tightens the noose on European trade, back in Britain, something remarkable is happening beneath the surface. But to understand why, you need to look at the other side of the ledger, because while Britain endures, continental Europe is being destroyed. And this, more than any single battle, is what will ultimately decide who wins the financial war. France, the architect of the blockade, is cannibalizing itself. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars have shattered French finances beyond repair. Hyperinflation has gutted savings. The assignats, revolutionary paper currency, collapsed years earlier, wiping out an entire generation of French wealth. France funds its wars not through borrowing, because no one will lend to it, but through conquest, plundering the treasuries of defeated nations, stripping gold from Italy, exacting tribute from Prussia, draining the wealth of Spain. It's a financial model that works only as long as you keep winning, and Napoleon, for all his genius, can't win forever. Across the rest of Europe, the picture is the same. Economies ravaged, trade routes severed, welfare costs soaring as populations displaced by war-strained local resources, real wages depressed by market disintegration, the breakdown of interconnected economic systems that had taken decades to build. The continent isn't just fighting a war, it's deindustrializing. Picture two ledgers side by side. On one, Britain, naval control intact, trade routes functioning, debt enormous but serviceable, new industries growing, columns written in black ink, numbers expanding year over year. On the other, continental Europe, blockaded, plundered, fragmented, hyperinflated. Red ink, shrinking margins, whole rows crossed out where economies have simply ceased to function. The gap between these two ledgers is widening every year of the war, and that gap will determine everything that comes next. Back in Britain, the industrial engine isn't just surviving, it's accelerating. The textile mills keep spinning. The iron foundries keep firing. Cotton output doubles, then doubles again. Exports and manufacturing output, against all odds, are growing even during the worst years of wartime austerity. The war is horrifically expensive, but the economy underneath it is transforming in ways that no one fully understands yet. New industries born out of wartime demand and peacetime innovation colliding are generating the tax revenues that keep the debt serviceable: cotton, iron, coal, machinery, engineering, shipbuilding. Britain isn't just surviving the war, it's industrializing through it. And here's the darkest irony of all: the war that's costing Britain so dearly is also eliminating its economic rivals. The war destroyed Europe and built Britain simultaneously. French manufacturing devastated, Dutch trade shattered, Belgian industry disrupted by years of occupation and counter-occupation. Every year the war continues, Britain's relative advantage grows, not because Britain is getting so much richer in absolute terms, but because everyone else is getting catastrophically poorer. The men in London's counting houses are beginning to realize it. Rothschild, already positioned in Consols, is watching these numbers with the intensity of a battlefield commander reading a map. The war isn't over, but the shape of the endgame is becoming visible. After 1812, the tide of war shifts. Napoleon's invasion of Russia has broken the Grande Armée. 600,000 men marched east. Fewer than 100,000 came back. The coalition is closing in from every direction, and in London, a new political figure is quietly engineering the financial endgame. Lord Liverpool becomes Prime Minister in 1812, inheriting the most indebted government in history. He is no visionary, no charismatic leader, no William Pitt reborn, but he is a ruthless fiscal manager who understands one thing with crystalline clarity: the debt has to be controlled, or military victory will be worthless. Under Liverpool, the government begins the agonizing process of turning deficits into surpluses. Spending is trimmed where possible without undermining the final campaigns. Tax revenues, still flowing from the industrial economy, are directed with increasing discipline toward debt servicing. And then, post-1813, as the Allies advance across Europe and peace becomes thinkable for the first time in a generation, something critical happens in the bond market. New Consol's issuance falls drastically. The government isn't borrowing anymore, it's repaying. The short-term debts of the final campaigns, roughly £50 million in exchequer bills, still lingering by 1817, are being converted to long-term instruments and managed down. Liverpool's budgets are grinding towards surplus with the relentless patience of a siege. And then, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, Consols begin to rise. The bonds that had crashed in the darkest days of the 1790s start climbing. Every Allied victory, every Napoleonic retreat, every Liverpool budget that inches closer to surplus sends them higher. The gold standard, abandoned 2 decades earlier, is now being discussed again. Its return will create deflation, making every pound worth more and every bond payment more valuable in real terms. What happens next is the greatest wealth transfer in European history, and almost nobody sees it coming. The financial war is over. Britain has won, not because it spent less, but because it survived longer, borrowed smarter, and controlled the seas while its rivals burned. The billion-pound wager now hung in the balance for 2 decades, and Britain had called the bluff. Debt, deflation, dynasties. History pivoted on this single instrument. And now, in one of history's great paradoxes, that mountain of wartime debt is about to make London the richest city on earth. Waterloo settled the military question, but the financial reckoning, the real transformation, was just beginning. Between 1815 and 1824, consols surged from their depressed wartime levels to historic peaks. For holders who had bought during the dark years and reinvested their income, the real returns exceed 300%. 300% in less than a decade. The mechanism is almost elegant in its simplicity. With new issuance drying up and the government running surpluses, the supply of consols contracts while demand expands. Every investor wants the safety of government paper, and there isn't enough to go around. Prices soar. The resumption of the gold standard, which Britain pursues in stages after 1819, creates deflation. Prices fall across the economy. And because consols pay a fixed income in pounds, every pound of that income buys more. The real value of bond payments rises even as the nominal price of everything else drops. Non-landed wealth quadruples in real terms. This isn't a modest gain. This is a transformation of the entire British wealth structure. The holders of government paper, financiers, bankers, wealthy families, institutional investors become fabulously rich. Not from trade, not from factories, from bonds. Economists would later call this the apotheosis of the rentier, the moment when living off government bond income became the most profitable activity in Britain. John Maynard Keynes, writing a century later, would call for the euthanasia of the rentier. But in the 1820s, the rentier class isn't dying. It's ascending to the pinnacle of British economic life. And the men who had positioned themselves for this moment, they became dynasties. Rothschild, the Manchester textile merchant who had pivoted to finance, had taken long positions in consols during the war years. When the peace rally came, his capital base quadrupled. The House of Rothschild, already influential, became the most powerful private financial institution in Europe. Within a generation, the family would be financing governments across the continent, their name synonymous with the very concept of financial power. Baring, like Rothschild, now sat atop a fortune built on government paper. Barings would become known as the sixth great European power, a merchant bank so influential that its word could move markets and its displeasure could topple ministries. And then there was David Ricardo, a man who combined intellectual brilliance with financial ruthlessness. Ricardo had invested heavily in consols and emerged immensely wealthy. He would go on to become one of the founders of modern economics, writing about trade, value, and wages with the authority of a man who had made and understood real money. Ricardo, the man who'd grown rich on bonds, would spend his later years explaining the very forces that had enriched him. Even landed aristocrats like Lord Bute found their non-landed wealth, their bond portfolios swelling beyond anything their estates could produce. In the counting houses of Lombard Street, clerks tallied consols' income in neat columns. The sound of wealth accumulating wasn't the roar of a factory floor. It was the quiet scratch of pen on paper, the turning of ledger pages, the soft murmur of figures that grew larger with each quarterly payment. The old money and the new money were converging on the same source, government debt. This is the moment London becomes the undisputed financial capital of Europe, not because of military conquest alone, not because of colonial extraction, though that played its role, because of bonds. Because a generation of war had created a mountain of government debt, and that debt, once peace arrived, became the most valuable asset class in the Western world. On the continent, the picture was reversed. France's finances were shattered by hyperinflation and the costs of Napoleonic conquest. The Dutch financial system, once Europe's most sophisticated, had been wrecked by occupation. German states were fragmented and impoverished. There was no continental rival to London's financial machine, and the Consol's wealth effect didn't stay locked in the bond market. As returns from government paper poured into the hands of the wealthy, interest rates fell. Capital became cheaper. And that cheap capital, as economists Gare, Rostow, and Schwartz would later document, flowed into the next great transformation, the Industrial Revolution at scale. Factory investment surged. Railway schemes proliferated. The wealth effect lowered the cost of capital just as British industry was ready to expand beyond anything previously imagined. Liverpool's budgets, now running surpluses, reinforced the cycle. Less government borrowing meant more capital available for private investment. The virtuous circle was complete. War debt funded victory. Victory drove bond prices up. Bond wealth funded industry, and industry generated the tax revenue that managed the debt. What followed was not a battle, but a financial revolution. and the world that emerged from this transformation, a world of financial capitalism, industrial power, and rentier wealth, would shape the next century of history. The debt overhang from the Napoleonic Wars would take decades to fully resolve, but the paradox held. The debt that should have crippled Britain instead funded the most dramatic economic transformation in human history. The industrial surge of the 1820s and 1830s, powered by cheap capital from the Consol's boom, gave Britain a head start that no rival would match for half a century. Continental Europe, devastated by 2 decades of war, lagged behind. France wouldn't fully modernize its financial system for decades. The financial gap that opened during the wars wouldn't close until the 20th century. For generations, the story of Britain's rise was told as a story of military triumph: Trafalgar, Waterloo, the thin red line. And those victories mattered. But the deeper story, the bond market story, was overlooked, misunderstood, or simply too abstract to make for good mythology. Nations don't build monuments to bond rallies. They don't name warships after fiscal surpluses, yet the Consol's boom did more to shape the 19th century than any single battle. The French economist Jean-Baptiste Say predicted that Britain's enormous debts and the crushing taxes that had sustained 2 decades of war would make it uncompetitive. He wasn't crazy. The logic was sound. A nation burdened by the largest debt in history, taxing its citizens at unprecedented rates, should have staggered into the peace. But Say missed the one variable that changed everything. The Consol's boom, the very instrument that created the debt, also created the wealth that rendered the debt manageable. The 300% returns that reshaped British society turned a liability on the national balance sheet into an asset in private hands. Remember the Britain of 1797, off the gold standard. Consols trading below 51, the 47% GDP crater gaping in its balance sheet. That Britain, desperate, hemorrhaging money, clinging to survival, is the same Britain that 3 decades later stood as the richest and most powerful nation on earth. The crisis wasn't the obstacle to Britain's rise. It was the mechanism. The crash created the buying opportunity. The war eliminated the competition. The debt created the asset. And the peace unlocked the wealth. A £1 billion gamble that changed the world forever. London, now the undisputed financial capital, would dominate global finance for the next century, its bond markets setting the price of money for empires and republics alike. The rentier's golden age, built on the carnage of a 22-year war, would fund railways and factories and steamships and the entire apparatus of Victorian supremacy. The age of empire was built not on a battlefield, but on a bond certificate, and the men who understood that built the world we still live in. If this story changed how you think about the relationship between war and wealth, subscribe. There's much more to come.